Hello and welcome to Future Building. I'm Mathew Aitchison and I'm Professor at Monash University and CEO of Building 4.0 CRC. In this podcast, we take a broad look at buildings and building in contemporary society and what's coming down the pipeline in the future. We'll talk with invited guests and experts in the field, where we'll cover news and trends along with research and developments in the industry. Future Building is proudly sponsored by Building 4.0 CRC. I'd like to invite you to pause and think about brands and products for a minute. Let's start with cars. Depending on your taste and your budget, or perhaps on your ownership history, I'm sure everyone can list a favorite car. How about fashion, shoes, apparel, luxury brands? The world is full of them, and we hardly have to think to come up with one. But now let's think about buildings, perhaps housing more specifically. Any brands come to mind? Any products? Any at all? If anything springs to mind, it's likely to be very local, like the name of a developer or a construction company that's been splashed all over the hoarding at a local building site or even on a crane. But that's not the kind of brand or products I mean. I've researched buildings for a long time, but at a global level, I really can't think of too many brands and their products at all. Why is that? Why does one of the biggest parts of the global economy have so few brands or recognizable products? If there should be a brand, one would think that it would most likely be in housing. On average, around 200,000 houses or apartments are sold every year in Australia. While that can't compare with the approximately 1.2 million sales in cars every year, it is one of the most significant purchases people will make in their lifetime. It's all the more curious that there's so few brands or recognizable products in housing, and all the more interesting to hear about the success of Nightingale Housing. In today's episode, I talk with the founder of Nightingale Housing and founder of the firm behind it, Breathe Architecture, Jeremy McLeod. I first saw Jeremy talk about Nightingale in 2015, but I'd already heard so much about Nightingale before I'd finally saw him on the stage. Today, Nightingale Housing is arguably the most sought-after brand in multifamily housing, renowned for its beautiful design, customer-centric approach, its sustainability principles, and its deep commitment to community and social ideas. Fortunately for us, Jeremy unpacks the story of Nightingale's development and also goes into great depth on its key ingredients. We also end the talk today with what Jeremy and his team have in mind for the future. I really hope you enjoy our interview as much as I did. I spoke with Jeremy in his Melbourne office in April 2024. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matthew.
Really great to have you here. Should declare for the audience that we've spent quite a bit of time together in recent times. So really keen to hear some of your story and get inside the stories of the various things you've been involved in. I want to start with your background, Jeremy. It's obviously in architecture. And I wanted to ask you, like I ask so many of our guests, how you think that education has shaped you and what you do in your practice.
Thanks, Matthew. I might just zoom out a little bit more and then I'll come back in. I think that the way that I was brought up by my parents, who were activists both in the kind of social equity piece. My dad was an advocate for public housing, and in the environmental space. I think that kind of helped establish what my values were. So in my undergrad, I kind of focused on sustainability and environmental design, which kind of aligned with those values. And then I went to become an architect. I got enamored with the idea of architecture. I kind of fell in love with it as a profession. I went to work for some really terrific Australian architects, and I got to see how the world really works and where architects sit in the food chain. And if you imagine a kind of a housing delivery, which is what I want to be working in, I want to be delivering sustainable housing for people that's meaningful. And what I found was that the people sitting at the top of the food chain were the people with all the money. So it's private equity or it's developers, and then sitting beneath them are development managers or project managers, and then they take advice from real estate agents. And then somewhere under there is the architect, and the architect needs to manage all of the sub-consultants, but doesn't really have any agency or power over driving the uh, the project. So it's interesting that kind of setting. But what did my education give to me? It's such a beautiful education in that it teaches you to look at very complex problems, do the research that you need to do to understand those problems, whatever the brief may be, from a you know laboratory to a housing project to a school to a town hall to a fire station. You need to research to understand how that thing works. So you need to get an understanding of how the thing works that you're trying to solve, where the thing sits, so how it works within the city and how you respond to the city or the landscape or the context that you sit within, and the kind of jurisdictional context that it sits within. And then, it's incumbent on us as architects to deliver a very, very elegant solution to a complex problem. So we've got to deliver a beautiful building, right? So I think that if you think about, we're educated in that, you and I are both trained architects. And so we're trained to solve complex problems in an elegant way. And so I think that the great thing that architecture has given me is that kind of design thinking. And now I apply that to not just a building, but it might be a financial model or a deal structure with a community housing provider and a landowner. And sometimes the solution to the problem is not a building, but we can still use design thinking to solve those complex problems.
Great. And so I also happen to know that you teach architecture, and those learnings that you talk about coming firstly from your parents as activists, and then what is for you a very strong social mission. We'll get into that a bit more later. Is that something you find you can pass on to students, and does that have a bearing on maybe what you think about the future of that profession or that discipline?
Absolutely. And look, we're all too busy to teach, Matthew, but we all should teach because it's important, right? That you think about those people that went before us and they gave their time and their energy to help shape future generations. And so, yeah, like I carve out, time. I work pretty closely with Melbourne University. I take one class a year, the thesis class out of Melbourne University. Um, and the first class, the first night on that class, on that night school that we take, we show we show a list of previous graduates from the Melbourne University that have come through our thesis class in the last, whatever it is, 10 or so years. And we show what they're doing in their lives and how they're having agency in society, and how that architecture has been a great tool for them, an educational tool for them to be able to have agency. And I show people like Jen Koulas that works in the affordable housing space and that knows more about alternative housing models in this country than anyone else. I show people like Kate Fitzgerald from Whispering Smith in Perth that kind of, out of frustration, started her own kind of development company called New Resident. But she's also been really actively involved in kind of policy making, working with the housing and planning ministers to help shape, residential density design codes. People that work in communications, people that work in sustainability, that actually have big impacts in the work that they do. And it's not necessarily drawing buildings. So yeah, I think I'm incredibly hopeful for the future of architecture. I'm really buoyed by the fact that everyone that we teach now understands, sustainability and carbon and the importance of that. Um, when we first started studying, I don't think that was, just on the agenda. And I think that we're giving them a bit of a basket case to solve, to be totally honest. But, the future looks bright in the coming generations, to be totally honest, Matthew.
Yeah. Look, I would agree from what I've seen and my vantage point, but I think you are also, you maintain an unusual practice, I think, for an architect. I think that's fair to say with your practice, breathe architecture. And I think, I'm going to pass small judgment here, Jeremy. I think it's unusual because you're also an entrepreneur. Not many entrepreneur architects. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about some of the other ventures that you and the team are working on?
Yeah, it's interesting that you use the term entrepreneur, which for me kind of has some kind of negative connotations because you think about venture capital or private equity and people chanting money, money, money. And I guess yes, you could definitely say that we're entrepreneurial, but why are we entrepreneurial? I think that's the important thing for us, and it's about trying to make sure that we can have agency. And I guess for us at Breathe, we want to design
Yeah.
yeah, the way that we practice architecture to have as much agency as possible. And I think sitting by the phone, waiting for a client to call us to tell us what they think we should do, to respond to what they think the market is, I don't think that's a good way to lead into a future that's going to be different from the past, right? It's just going to be more of the same. Unless you, and we do have enlightened clients that do want to do great things. But if you want to really change the future, um, then I think that you need to roll up your sleeves and be engaged in that. I read the book, Let Your People Go Surfing by Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia. It talked about, how he started Patagonia as, just climbing equipment, right? So climbing hooks to, bang into rocks so that you could climb, great mountains in California. Um, And then he went climbing one day and he found the mountain covered in this climbing equipment that he'd made, or that his company had made, which had hammered into a mountain. And he realized that what he established the company for was to allow people to engage with nature and the landscape and be involved in the planet. And what he realized was that he was actually actively involved in destroying that kind of, one little piece at a time. And so he kind of had this kind of moment where he went back and said, we need to design a company that isn't just about making money, but it's actually about, giving back to the planet, And so he basically redesigned Patagonia to be a company that would exist to save the planet. And so, of course, everything that they do is now viewed through a triple bottom line lens. So, how does it respond to the planet? Does it make enough money to pay for itself and grow? And what are the social implications of that? And does everyone get paid fairly? Is there any kind of, slave labor involved in that? And so, the reason that a Patagonia wetsuit costs, whatever it is, $700, not $200, is because it doesn't destroy the planet or the ocean that you're swimming in. It doesn't use child labor to produce it, and they offer you a lifetime guarantee on that product, right? So that they will fix it forever, so that you never have to buy another wetsuit ever again because they think that that's the right thing to do. So anyway, for us, I think I looked at Patagonia and said that's where we want to be, and how do we have agency as architects? And yeah, I think for us, Matthew, it was, initially we thought we could have a lot of agency through education. So we do some teaching, that's great. But we thought we needed to educate the broader development industry that there was a possible housing future, let's say in the apartment space or in the medium density space, that could be about housing that was sustainable, that was affordable, that built community, and that wasn't just sad grey glass boxes with too much glass and not enough insulation. So we bought the site that initially was called Nightingale Apartments, which then became the Commons in 2007. So that was Tam, my partner, and I. So she's the co-founder of Breathe. I couldn't have done anything without her. But Tam and I bought that site with kind of a couple of architects that were working with us at the time, some friends. And the idea was that when we finished that building, we would open it up to the development sector to take all of our clients through to say, this is what's possible. And of course, we finished the Commons. It was way more successful than we had imagined. So on Open Houses Melbourne, they opened it up in 2014 and 1,016 people came through the kind of clicker, the door person's counter on a miserable winter's day to look at an apartment building in Brunswick, which I found amazing. And despite the fact that we'd spoken to every developer in the city saying, look, this is what you can do, they also saw the commons as a kind of as an outlier or as a blip on the radar rather than a possible trend or a possible future trajectory. And so when that project, which was incredibly successful as a standalone project, the actual intent from our team at Breathe was to use it as an educational piece, which it was really educational, but it didn't educate the people that we actually needed educated or that we actually needed to change their practice, which was the developers. And so the following year, Tam and I decided to do it again. And we bought the site across the road from the Commons. And then we spoke to, every great Melbourne architect that we could think of to come and join us. And we got them to co-fund the project with us. And we built Nightingale, which then became Nightingale 1. And then off the back of that, we worked with some of those architects to establish Nightingale Housing, a not-for-profit housing organisation. And the waiting list, when we first finished the Commons, started with 11 people on a spreadsheet, and there's now over 20,000 people on a database at Nightingale. And I'm not saying that they all want to buy a house tomorrow, but when we now design a Nightingale building, we ballot the entire building in a day. I mean, that's always happened since we've built Nightingales, but it's incredible. So what we've proved now to the development industry is that it was not a blip. It is a trajectory, that housing that is sustainable, that is built for people, not just profit. And I'm saying that obviously developers need to make money, but I'm saying that there's a way to mediate those two things. And buildings that are built for community, you can do all of those things simultaneously, and that there is a massive market for that. So Nightingale's been kind of, this incredible thing. And it's interesting for me, Matthew, because the Commons and Nightingale only exist, in my view, because of our failure of our state governments, essentially, to house our people civilly, and the failure of our federal governments to build the right taxation settings that allow all people to access housing equitably and not to unfairly offer tax concessions or financial incentives for a small subset of our society to buy multiple houses and use that for tax-free gains.
I'm going to stop you there, Jeremy, because I find that very interesting. But I think what's different about you, before we talk about what other solutions are, is that you took the risk, which is the original definition of an entrepreneur, is somebody who takes risks to do these things, which most architects don't. Most architects don't play in this way. They enact a service provision. But you and your partner were tempted into that fray, and I would assume that's because of the issue that you identified earlier around where you sit in the food chain and the fact that you wanted to have agency. And you thought there's a solution in here. And so for those listeners who've never encountered Nightingale, and there might be overseas listeners, for example, because I think as you point out, it's an incredibly trusted brand here in Australia. Everybody knows Nightingale Housing. What are the key ingredients that you came up with? And what is it about those that make them not a blip, but a trajectory, in your words?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it's relatively straightforward, right? If you think about Patagonia as a triple bottom line clothing company or a climbing company, Nightingale is a triple bottom line housing company. So, it focuses on delivering sustainable housing, on housing that builds community, and housing that is for people, not profit. So I won't use the word affordable, because despite our best attempts, Matthew, we cannot build the housing cheap enough to be able to house the people we want to, right? But anyway, we can talk about that. What does it mean from a sustainability point of view? Let's talk about that first. And maybe how do you deliver sustainability and affordability and community simultaneously? Because everyone else historically has said, well, you can choose one of those things, but you can't do all three of those things. Everyone says that sustainability and affordability are at opposite ends of the spectrum. and you can't do them, you can't hold them in the same place at the same time. And I would disagree wholly on that. And so if you think through the way that we approach it, it's this idea of building less to give more. It's about a sustainability of reductionism. It's about systems thinking. So what can we take out of the project to make the project better? What can we take out of the project to help build community or reduce cost and improve the lived environment? I mean, it sounds weird, right? But I'll step through some examples with you. So, if we think through Nightingale 1 or the Commons as an example, as a kind of worked example, we take out the basement car park. By taking out the basement car park, we take out the embodied carbon, the risk of excavating in kind of clay and basalt. We take out the program time of digging a basement. We also reduce the cost of all of the housing by about, $50,000 each, or, let's call it 10,000, or sorry, 10% of each of the houses. And then when we think about the ground floor where the ramp would have been into the car park, we put a retail tenancy. So in the Commons, that was sold as a wine shop, and that wine shop was sold for $425,000. The value of that $425,000, along with the saving of the $750,000 in the car park, then gets put into the building to increase the performance of our double glazing, to increase the performance of our insulation, to build an incredible rooftop garden, a beautiful shared laundry, which then opens up onto this rooftop garden and has this view over the city. So importantly, thinking about kind of community and equity, we put our communal spaces on the roof, not our penthouses. After we start putting this beautiful laundry on the roof, we can then take all the individual laundries out of each of the apartments, which then saves us about $6,000 per apartment. But it also gives us an extra 2 square meters in each apartment. So our living rooms get bigger. We don't need 24 washing machines in every apartment, throughout the whole building. We don't need 48 taps. We don't need 24 ton dishes. We don't need a sea of drainage pipe and water supply pipe running through the building. We reduce complexity in the building. We reduce embodied carbon in the building. We reduce the price of the apartments, and we get to spend some of that money in buying 6 killer state-of-the-art washing machines on the roof, and building this beautiful rooftop laundry that all of our residents get to come together in. So less embodied carbon, less cost, less operational cost, but a shared facility like the Village Well in an Italian village where people can come together to do simple things. I know it sounds romantic and idealistic, and you might think this guy's full of shit, but I lived in the Commons with Tam, my partner, for 7 years. And I kid you not, it was magical. And we wanted to see whether we moved into the Commons, installed data loggers to kind of measure internal thermal comfort, indoor air quality, to monitor our water use and energy use, to kind of get, to try and get data on it, hard data. But what we found is that the beauty of the Commons, the magical thing in the Commons was actually the community. And if I think back to where I first started meeting all of the people in the Commons, it wasn't in the rooftop dining area. It was actually in the laundry, this weird little place where me as an architect would go to wash my clothes. And then I get to meet, Kate, who works at the Australian Ballet there, and we get to kind of talk. And I meet her partner, Jace, who's a graphic designer. And then over time, we become friends. And before you know it, there's a group of us, holidaying together to the Blue Mountains or driving down to the Otways to have a kind of hiking trip together in a share car, of course, Matthew, not in a privately owned vehicle. But anyway, I'll just step through another couple of examples. Commons. there's a love affair with bathrooms in the Australian real estate market, which is led by, real estate agents and a perception of what people want. We take out all of the second bathrooms. So every apartment has one bathroom only because that's all you need. We save the cost of everyone's apartment by about $35,000 by taking out that second bathroom, but also their living areas get kind of, 6 or 7 square meters bigger. So, you get these big living spaces where you can have 6 or 8 seater dining tables. You get less bathroom, you get the same size apartment. And you spend most of your time, about 85% of your apartment time, in your living, dining, and kitchen space, not in your bathrooms. And you think about all the carbon we pull out by not putting in the tiles, the sanitary fittings, and all of the maintenance or the cleaning time required to clean bathrooms and the chemicals required to clean bathrooms across the life of the building. So kind of, big moves to take those things out. Downstairs in the building, obviously we've taken out the car park, but we put in instead bike parking numbers that meet Netherlands standards, not Australian standards. So in Australia or in Brunswick where we were, we needed 5 bike parks, but instead we put in 72 bike parks. We get places where people can meet and park their bikes, use active transport, ride into the city, walk to the local shops. And then again, from a systems thinking point of view, Matthew, we work with outside of the realms of what an architect would normally do, in that we would work with GoGet, a car share provider, to write a partnership agreement with them saying that if you live in a Nightingale building, you get the same driving rates as GoGet staff members. So you're part of a car club or a car share membership program, which means that you can drive a little car around, Brunswick for as little as $7.30 an hour. So it's much, much cheaper to be part of a car share system if you live in this building rather than owning your own private car, not even to mention the cost of paying for a basement car park. We think that same kind of systems thinking through to taking out all of the gas in the building, electrifying the building, but not just thinking about our operational carbon from a demand side, but also thinking about the supply side. So we then work with an energy company and an embedded network company to build an embedded network that would be owned by the resident group. That would then mean that we can bulk buy 100% certified green power with no carbon, that's buying its power essentially, for all intents and purposes, out of large-scale wind or solar, and selling those electrons into the building. And then we lock that in again using design understanding to design a system. Sometimes it's not drawing a building, but designing the governance rules to make sure that that's locked in perpetuity. So by writing 2 simple clauses in the Owners Corporation rules, we can lock in that the building has to be powered from 100% renewables in perpetuity, and that the building has to go an annual carbon audit in perpetuity. I think that the last big thing that we use from a design point of view to write into the Owners Corporation rules, which is incredibly important, is that in Australia, we all build on stolen land. We build on land without treaty. We build on land from the oldest continuing culture on our planet, and land that was taken brutally off the First Nations Australians. We talk a lot about reconciliation in the built environment, but we have very, very few ways to deal with that. We don't know how to do it from a built form point of view in a meaningful way. Like, we can try to engage with traditional owners, but they're incredibly overloaded with, everyone kind of asking them, how do we respond in a meaningful way? So instead we do one simple thing, which is we design in a clause into the Owners Corporation rules saying that if you live in a Nightingale building, you will pay the rent. And what that looks like is basically it's locked in perpetuity, that everyone living in the Nightingale building will pay $100 a year. It's $2 a week, 30 cents a day, which goes and gets paid towards the traditional owners, the people that owned that land before colonisation. And why is that important? So it seems too little, I know, but when you apply it to every Nightingale building, let's say 500 apartments have been completed so far, that's $50,000 a year, which goes to traditional owners. In another 2 years, there'll be 1,000 Nightingale apartments that are finished. That's $100,000 a year, every year. Across 10 years, that's $1 million. But imagine if we can use that as an impetus to help other big developers like Lendlease, Stockland, Frasers, Mirvac to come and help do the same thing. That $100,000 a year turns to $1 million a year, turns to $10 million a year, which could be the starting of a fund which would help the 4% of Australians that are First Nations Australians to buy back a piece of their own country and help secure their own housing destiny and their own housing security in their own country. So anyway, I think that it's interesting that you and the funny thing about those things, those owners corporation rules, it sets the agenda for how the building operates from a governance point of view, but it doesn't cost the developer or Nightingale or the initial purchasers any more money. It's just a decision that we make. In fact, the bulk buying of the green power saves the residents money because they're all buying green power at about 30% under market for what everyone else is paying for black power in the market. From a materials point of view, Matthew, we take out all the plasterboard ceilings. We take the chrome plating off the door hardware, off the tapware. We kind of strip everything out that we can, and so you get this building that's kind of that's very simple. It's pretty robust. You get to see the exposed kind of fire services, the exposed sprinkler pipes, the exposed, spiral exhaust duct. So it does feel quite industrial, but its embodied carbon is low. And when you take out ceilings, it means that you're exposing all the thermal mass of the concrete above, which means that the apartments actually perform incredibly well when you design them to be cross-ventilated and you passively design them to shade them in summer and allow winter sun penetration in winter. So we get a really, really great kind of thermal envelope and lots of volume in those spaces.
Well, the other thing, Jeremy, that I will say is that, I can verify all of the things that you've just listed out because I've had the pleasure of having, undertaken a tour with a group led by yourself. I think those things are exactly there, and the sense of community that you talk about particularly is really there. It also, what I think was also really interesting is the way that there is continuous learning between the different projects that you've been able to implement as you go, because you started, as you say, with that commons building, turning a lot of the common expectations in the market around what is a multifamily apartment building, what is an apartment worth living in, what do we need, what don't we need, turning those expectations on their head through this process of reductionism and continuous learning has proved to be an intensely valuable thing, and it's something we just don't see in the mass market. I mean, Jeremy, would you agree with the contention that in the mass market of multifamily, medium and high rise building, there is a conventional wisdom around what the market wants, and that just keeps being built and perpetuated into the future? Do you think I've got that right?
100%. There is, Matthew, there's this bizarre feedback loop that happens in the mass housing market. And basically form follows finance. So what I've learned through the whole Nightingale journey is that to secure senior debt, so that's the money you need from the bank to build a building. So let's say we're going to build a $40 million project, and so it's going to be $40 million on construction, but I need to secure let's call it 20 or $25 million in equity to get to the point. So I secure that through someone who puts in the money at the start, but then when I want to build the building, I need about $40 million in debt from the bank. What the bank says to us is, that's fine. Let us look at your feasibility, and we need to provide a valuation report which says this is what we're selling and this is how much that's worth. When you go to provide the valuation report, property valuers who might have done a 2-year degree at, or a diploma, and it might be quite young, they'll come and look at what is the property worth that you are building. And they will assess the value of your sales, your apartments, against other comparable sales in the same postcode. And so this is interesting, the power that valuers have to shape the future based on the past. So if everything in that postcode has been 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom, inbuilt laundry, air conditioning everywhere, a basement car park, and there'll be no shared facilities, but if that's what's been in the market, and then that's been selling at, let's call it $10,000 a square meter, then that's what the market understands at $10,000 a square meter. If you then come and say, I'm going to build a building with no car parking, no air conditioning, because I don't need it because I've designed the building to actually respond to the climate, no second bathroom, no individual laundry, it's the same size, but instead I'm going to provide something that's got highly thermally efficient. It's got a killer rooftop garden. It's got shared rooftop facilities. It's got all of these other benefits. The valuers don't know what to make of it. And so we found with the Commons and Nightingale 1, it was near on impossible to secure bank debt to build the building. And in fact, to build Nightingale 1, so the Commons was made possible by an impact investor called Small Giants, who basically turned up like a knight in shining armor with a suitcase full of cash to fund that project. Because I could not, I'm good at doing lots of hard things. I could not for the life of me secure debt to build the Commons. And Small Giants saved that project. I learned a lot from them, but by the time I got to Nightingale, I still couldn't get bank debt because they were like, what's this? You're an architect. You want to do this thing that's different from the past. How do we value it? If we can't value it, even though you've sold 100% of your apartments, so we'd sold 100% of apartments through the ballot, which my proposition to them was that proves the value of those apartments. They're saying that there's no proof that when you go to settle those apartments, that those residents will actually be able to get loans, because the people giving them loans will also be valuers, and the valuers won't know how to compare it to the current market. So your purchase contracts are pretty much worthless because all these people won't be able to settle at the back end because there's no comparable values. So in the end, I had to build a lending syndicate. In fact, this woman from Sydney called Hannah Ebling from a social impact finance group called CIFA put together this lending syndicate from kind of Christian Super, a couple of high net worth individuals, and CIFA itself to raise. I only needed $6 million in debt. I spoke to 34 banks. It nearly killed me. Hannah Ebling put this lending syndicate together. They raised the capital. We completed Nightingale 1. When we completed Nightingale 1, get this, Matthew, when the valuers finally came through on the final project, a couple of the apartments in the Commons across the road had resold. And when they'd resold, they went from being kind of the cheapest apartments in Brunswick to being some of the most expensive apartments in Brunswick because of how much demand there was. And we can talk about that later, about the unintended consequences of, success, I would say, but that was definitely not my intention. It was kind of depressing. But what that did for the property values of Nightingale 1 is that when people went to settle, the valuations coming back from the banks on mortgage times, like some of the 2-bedders were being valued at $92,000 over the contract price, which then meant, interestingly, that these first home buyers who were looking to take out mortgage insurance because they didn't have a 20% deposit suddenly had over 20% equity in a project because it was more than what they paid. And so it was saving some people like $35,000 off the life of their mortgage because they didn't have to pay lender's mortgage insurance. So
that's brilliant. I thought you were going to say the banks were paying them to take out the mortgage.
So anyway, look, so by the time we finished Nightingale 1, we were just lucky enough to have a couple of sales in the Commons
Yeah.
which verified what the value was. And then since then, every Nightingale since then has been a walk in the park, right? Because we've got
Yeah.
comparable sales. But every time we push to a new postcode or a new jurisdiction or a new state, we have the same conversations with banks and this same fear about mortgage and settlements and perceived values because this thing is different to the past.
Well, Jeremy, I think this is a really, opportune moment to ask, hearing that war story about the capital raise for that very first project, why is it so hard to innovate in the building industry and particularly in housing?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, right? In the United States, for as much of it as it fails in so many kind of social and equitable aspects, the United States encourages entrepreneurialism. It encourages innovation. There are lots of government grants and incentives to do big, hard, important things to try and stimulate the market. It might be production or the economy. In Australia, the view of the government is that since the 80s, they've been divesting from public housing, and it has become the responsibility of the private sector to provide housing and increase supply to the market. That's kind of been the the kind of the recent neoliberal view. Also, I
Yeah.
think that what's happened in the last 30 years, if you think about Australia or Victoria, actually Victoria's Housing Commission in the 50s and 60s, and how bold that was, building a manufacturing plant to build 1,400 homes a year, to train apprentices, to do all of those things. And then you think about probably the last 20 years in Victoria, the jurisdiction that I kind of, or the state that I live and work in, and the lack of faith or confidence in itself, the lack of courage to do big, hard things, and the pushing of risk. So they have absolutely no appetite for failure, right? No one wants failure within the state
Mhm.
government, so they push the risk elsewhere. And the problem is, if you push that into the private market and people are using their own money to do that, they too have very, very little appetite for risk. Like, if it's not going to be the government that's going to drive innovation, to test it and prove it for the marketplace, it is difficult for people, particularly using private equity or other people's money, to be able to do that because company directors have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to return money. The way that the whole system is set up is to not innovate and not take risks.
Well, that's right. And I think that's what you've butted up against, but that's what you've successfully overcome. I think looking at what you've done, and one of the achievements of Nightingale and Breathe Architecture is really to prove out the case for this very different set of expectations about what good living looks like, to demonstrate that to the market, and again, taking your terminology to show that that's not just some vision of some luminary. It's not a blip, it's a trajectory. People want this. And I suppose that's my next question. Uh, I think I heard some surprise in your voice before, but 20,000 people on the wait list. I'm not aware of any other organization that has that kind of kudos in the market. Why do you think it's so popular? You've obviously spoken a lot about the different ingredients and the different features that you've got, but what is it that has sparked the public imagination so much, do you think?
Well, I mean, Matthew, I mean, I'd love to say that, I'm a genius, that we're really smart, but if you, if you sold housing in a housing crisis without profit, I reckon you could build a 20,000 long wait list in about 3 minutes. So,
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
it's actually, um, I think that a lot of the list is to do with desperation, I think. Um,
Yeah, but I think that's a slightly different point. Let me take a different tack if you don't mind, because you're perhaps being too modest. People love Nightingale, right? Yes, it is a financial solution for some people who find it difficult to get into the market because you offer a variety of apartment types and sizes and things like that. But people genuinely love this. It inspires, one of those elusive qualities that we talk about a lot in good design, delight. It inspires delight in their users. I think rather than undersell yourself and say, well, if I'm offering something that's a little cheaper than the next guy, we're always going to have customers. I think what is it about that delight? You know what I'm talking about here. People love the place.
Yeah, look, and I have spoken to other people who have got like incredible housing models doing incredible things, but they tend to focus on one thing. And where they tend
Hmm.
to kind of shape down their focus is on design, right? So,
Yeah.
you're trained as an architect, I'm trained as an architect. Nightingale was, designed around this idea that we would um, build a model to enable architects to actually innovate and build really great housing and take the financial pressure off. So when you're building housing for people, not housing for profit, suddenly, and you open up the risk appetite to say, look, we are going to innovate, we are going to try new things, we're going to evolve this over time. It means that when I embarked on the Nightingale Village project, you know, I didn't go and build 203 apartments by Breathe Architecture. I invited the best architects in the country to come and join us. So we got six other architects to come and join Breathe on Nightingale Village. So it's not one building that looks like 203 apartments. It ended up
Mm.
being, you know, six buildings, six communities by six different architects, uh, with each one with its own kind of take on Nightingale, this idea of sustainability of reductionism, you know, each one with its own, quirky take on community. But it means that it lands, in Brunswick, kind of largely around this one street, Duckett Street, um, where these buildings sit on both sides of the street. But it feels like it's part of a smaller urban grain. So it's kind of, smaller community sizes. So the buildings themselves are really beautiful. So the design is really considered. The design is incredible, elegant, really considered, well resolved by great architects. I think that's kind of one thing, and I think that the other thing is that if you think about how Nightingale communicates to the outside world, there's no kind of marketing and sales team. It's all about honesty, right? It was meant to be established as taking out all the middlemen. So taking out the real
Mhm.
estate agent, taking out the marketing team, taking out the display suite, taking out the advertising budget, and all of those costs that you normally put into a project for a for market developer. Instead, you just take that off the price of the housing, right? And then you communicate really openly and honestly with your potential residents, and you say, hi, we're Nightingale. This is what we do for you, but this is what we expect of you if you come and live here. If we're going to be
Mm.
selling you housing without profit, we're going to be trying to build housing that is, carbon neutral in operation. We're going to be trying to be building a place that becomes the armature for community to exist. When you come here, we expect you to attend 2 working bees a year. We expect you to attend 4 community meetings a year to talk about what your community can do to be better, like whether it's to have a street party or whether it's to, help planting on the urban upfield kind of rail corridor. What does your community want to do? So there is, and then we're also really honest about what the buildings do and what they don't do. So historically, we were designing our buildings without active cooling, without air conditioning in there, just sweep fans and good passive design. And we have to
Mm.
tell people that for 4% of the year under our current modeling, it looks like the buildings might breach 27 degrees in summer. So can you live with that? Does that work for you? If not, this is not the place for you. So
Yeah.
that we don't have car parks, and if you have to have a car park located for you, this is not the place for you. Also, now we don't do customization, right? So our buildings, we try to replicate. So if we're building like Nightingale Preston, for example, there's 55 apartments. There's only 5 apartment types. Everything stacks. And so unlike a a developer with a real estate agent where they might throw in a fridge or you want a bath, sure, you can have that. You want to move the wall, whatever you want. We don't do any of that. So you have to accept that if you come to a Nightingale, it is way into the housing market. And it's not a place for you to kind of have your own version of the block. So if you want to customize, we don't do that. And I think that the other thing is that we build in 20% social housing and affordable housing into every one of our buildings. So you need to be comfortable that if you live in a Nightingale, that you're part of a broader community with people from all sections of the community, all socioeconomic backgrounds. And if you're not comfortable with that, this is not the place for you. So our first 20% of housing might go to women's property initiatives or Housing Choices Australia. Our next 20% is sold to first home buyers, but it's sold under a priority ballot with a income cap on it. And that priority ballot goes to First Nations Australians, people with a disability, carers of people with a disability, key workers like early childhood or aged care workers under an income cap. So you've got to, and interestingly, older single women over 55 without housing security, which is the fastest growing homeless cohort in the country. So
Wow.
you've got to be comfortable with all of those things. And I think we thought, Matthew, when we said, okay, here are all the things that you've got to be comfortable with to come to a Nightingale, we thought it would turn people off. But interestingly, it's kind of had the opposite effect where I think for people, what it says is that we have integrity, and you might not agree with everything that we do, but we are honest. And so I think that has built a lot of trust, that people trust that, we're not going to sell them a lie or a dream. We're going to tell them what it does and what it doesn't do, what's great about it and what's not great about it, and come or don't come, and there's no pressure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's obviously building off a base, perhaps where that trust and transparency is not there. So I think I hadn't thought about that being part of the model, but I can really see that. Jeremy, I want to step backwards a little bit in our conversation, a little bit to the side of Nightingale, but building on that to some degree to this, my accusation earlier that you are an entrepreneur. And
Yeah, yeah.
part of that, I think, that I've identified is this: you and the team have a very strong feel for inventing brands,
Yeah, yeah.
which I think is kind of unusual, particularly for an architect, because oftentimes we're taught to that every problem is unique and every solution should be unique, and you never copy and paste and all of those sorts of things. Where did this, and as I say, Nightingale's become this very widely acknowledged brand in government, in industry, in academia. It's used as a case study everywhere. Perhaps for our international audience may not be aware of that. But where did this talent for brand come from?
No idea, Matthew. I mean, it's interesting that that you think it's about brand when I just think it's about I see something that needs to happen in the marketplace, and so it makes sense for us if it doesn't exist and we can't get someone else to do it, to just roll up our sleeves and do it ourselves. Like if you think about Nightingale, actually, let's start with Breathe. Why is it called Breathe and not Jeremy McLeod Architects? It's because I knew that I couldn't do this on my own, that it would be through working collaboratively with other people, and that the future is not just going to be me, right? So Patagonia isn't called Yvon Chouinard Proprietary Limited. It's about, a beautiful place in the world. So for me, Breathe was named Breathe because I knew that it wasn't just going to be about me. And I wanted it to represent, this idea that we could have buildings that would breathe. Nightingale, again, I didn't just want it to be about Breathe because there were so many talented architects that I could see all around our city that just weren't being engaged in multi-residential housing. I
Yeah.
wanted to invite them in. I wanted to share our IP, and I knew that it could go viral with more voices, great architects and designers kind of pushing from a grassroots level up. Also, our first project was on Florence Street. And as you may or may not know, that Florence Nightingale is commonly thought of as a nurse, but she was actually solely responsible for changing the entire healthcare system from the ground up using kind of statistics and data and analysis, and then lobbying up the food chain, like right up to the Queen, to change the way that healthcare worked. And so her involvement as a nurse in the healthcare system changed everything. So for me, she's this massive hero. So the fact that our first project happened on Florence Street made me think that as a group of architects, we, like Florence Nightingale as a nurse, could try to change the housing system from the ground up. I think that, goodbye gas for us, Matthew, as architects, we're engaged to
So
build.
just say a little bit more about Goodbye Gas,
Oh,
if you
okay.
would.
So yeah, what are the other things? Yeah, and I guess, how do we describe this? Uh, yeah, I describe it as kind of, Breathe is the band, and that Nightingale is an album that, and you think about the Commons is the first album, that Nightingale Housing is the second album, and then for us, we want to look at how else do we have agency, and it's not just sitting here as architects designing, right? So Goodbye Gas for us was, we work as architects, building buildings for other people, um, and we can deliver, low carbon buildings, or pull out as much. We can pull out operational carbon on new buildings, but we can't solve operational carbon on existing buildings. So in Australia, there's a love affair with gas, has been for a long time. There's over 1 million homes in Victoria, the state that I live in, that have gas plumbed into them. And people find it difficult to exit gas out of their homes, because they need a plumber, an electrician. If they've got a stone bench top, they need a stonemason to come and cut the bench top to fit an induction cooktop. If you're changing your heating and cooling, you'll need a mechanical or an air conditioner installer to come and do that. And then people struggle in Australia to be able to manage those trades in an elegant way. And so people just don't bother. They find it too difficult. They're busy. So the idea of Goodbye Gas was actually by a friend of mine who lived in the Commons and then moved into Nightingale 1, Ben Russell. And he wanted to electrify everything, particularly in Australian homes, to try and solve this operational carbon problem. And so I just brought one of my brilliant young graduate architects, Marcella, to come and work with Ben. We helped Ben raise $300,000 to establish Goodbye Gas. I sit on, in that company as a director. And then Marcella has been placed in Goodbye Gas to help shape that, because that I think a lot about architects and the way that they think. And so Goodbye Gas is this great little kind of electrification brand, electrifying everything. So, and we've just kind of, just pushed into the Sydney market. So that's what Goodbye Gas is doing.
Fantastic. I mean, I love that business. I know there are others that we may not get to today, Jeremy, because of length and things. But I detected in your voice when I said brand a little moment of pause, because perhaps like entrepreneur for you, it has a certain connotation. But maybe we go back to the root like we did with entrepreneur and say it's actually about somebody who takes excessive risk. And we think about, what does brand actually mean? Well, when brands were first invented, they were really a symbol for quality, right? And so what is quality in our field and in the present day? And I think, problem identification, product market fit, these are things that you excel at. And so I think identifying that it's more than just this kind of quite, you know, late capitalist identification as brand, and this kind of trashy view of brands, but actually being a symbol for an underlying quality and a reliability and meaning, I think is where I'm coming from with this, because both Goodbye Gas and Nightingale, you know, perhaps Goodbye Gas being more at the beginning of its journey, but Nightingale certainly haven't having ascended to the top of the tree, as it were. both very, very strong brands, and they connote quality. They connote all of the principles that you put forward about sustainable building, community-oriented design, and people, not profit, and trust, as you said, right? Inspiring that trust in the people. And I think that's these. I'm not a brand uh, expert. I couldn't tell you the constituent parts that make it up, but I bet if we did have a branding expert on this podcast with us right now, they'd be talking about many of the things that you've achieved as being the fundamental steps. And I think, again, Jeremy, that that is very unusual in our field. I can't think of another brand in housing, not another brand that compares. I can't think of another brand, right? So I think that is a real achievement, and you might be somewhat bashful about that. That might not sit well on your shoulders, but I think that is a huge achievement, and I think it raises a lot of questions about the way we interact in that, which I think also, Jeremy, brings us to um, the kind of part of the conversation where we probably start to wrap up a bit. I know that this is probably going to be a difficult question for you, but I want to do it anyway. And if you've got 20 answers to this, then we might need to speed through them. But I wanted to ask you, what's next for you? What's next for Breathe Architecture? Any more albums up the sleeve?
Yeah, well, yeah. There's two albums in the studio at the moment, Matthew, and then one that we're writing. The one that we're writing is it's about small footprint housing, and I'm going to share this with you openly, so that if someone else wants to take this idea and go and do it better than us and do it now, that's great. So then I won't have to worry about it. But imagine a future, where we could build housing that's half the size. It's got half the embodied carbon. It has half the operational carbon. It's half the cost to purchase or to rent, and it's half the cost of the utilities. It's half the cost to the planet. But within that, what we've learned through our Nightingale example is that while you can have a smaller personal space, you can have some really delightful communal spaces. So while people might be living in a smaller house, per se, they've got shared spaces to be able to come together. So not just a shared laundry, but also a shared workshop, a shared co-working space. So it's just like a co-living space, but I think that at the moment, co-living in Australia looks like just a way to make money, or it's expensive student housing for adults. And I would love to build co-housing the way that the Swedes do it, in a meaningful way, to build community, and again, to kind of focus on that in a way that's about people, not profit, or a financial model where there's a cross subsidy in there where it does both of those things. So again, anyone out there that wants to take that, knock yourself out. Let me know though, so I don't go and do it as well. The two the two albums in the studio at the moment, Matt. One is I'm working with two incredible guys in Queensland, and one guy in South Australia, on a project called One Earth Property. And really that's about, using everything that we know at Breathe Architecture, all of our experience to work with them, so they come from finance, development, and site acquisition backgrounds, to help affordable housing providers, so CHPs, to deliver housing that is sustainable and that delivers great community outcomes. I think that I have seen some housing stock that's been delivered with absolutely good intentions by community housing providers, but that is just focused on the single bottom line of affordability, and that they have been poor built form outcomes. They have delivered poorly on community. And in my view, Matthew, they have actually a poor carbon story over time as well. They're expensive to maintain, they're expensive to operate, and I think that they have a relatively short shelf life. So our view of One Earth Property is to help CHPs to deliver triple bottom line outcomes for them that work for them financially, but also work from a kind of climate change perspective as well. Lastly, the last album is the thing that I'm most excited about. And when you talk about, brands, Matthew, it took me back to Merchant Builders, in the 70s in Melbourne, which was established by, by David Yankin, and he worked with great Melbourne architect Graham Gunn. And that was an incredible brand in the 70s. And before that, it would have been Robin Boyd and Neil Clarahan and a whole bunch of other architects in the 50s called the Small Home Service. Both of those operated historically in the 50s and the 70s, delivering great housing outcomes, at the city's edges, not necessarily in the city. So if you think about Nightingale being a medium density solution close to the city in the inner ring, I think it's time for architects to get involved at the city's edges. We need to accept that unless we can impact housing policy, which let's say that we can't, unless we can impact planning policy, which let's say we can't, and our outer ring keeps on growing, or we're doing more regional work, we accept this idea of, polycentric cities, then as architects, we need to be working with volume builders, the people that deliver, the vast bulk of Australian housing to deliver quality housing. So I'm working on a project called Grounded with one of the country's biggest volume builders, ABN. And, Matthew, my work with you and building 4.0 CRC has been about this idea of looking at housing as a basic human right, looking at industrialized construction, looking at housing as product, not as a bunch of tradies building out of utes, and not as some of these volume builders have 600 house plans in their books. Each of those house plans has 4 facades to choose from. And then when you choose one, you go inside their display center and you can choose any number of materials. And so while everyone calls them cookie cutter, they're anything but. There's too much complexity and too much customization. And so the idea of Grounded is that we build less customization. We build really beautiful product. And importantly, we build right-sized product. So we build housing that kind of ranges in size from 50 square meters to 150 square meters, because Australia currently has the biggest housing in the world on average at 239 square meters. But we've also got one of the highest carbon emissions per capita, so this is the fun thing. So obviously the solution to, and the only way we solve for net zero, the only way we meet our Paris climate agreement targets, the lowest hanging fruit is to reduce our operational carbon, which is linked to the built environment, our embodied carbon, which is linked to the built environment. So that's our biggest carbon footprint. So we have to solve for that. How do we solve for housing affordability? We build right-size housing, not houses that are 4 times too big for people. And how do we deliver on community in a growing sense of isolation? We start to think back to villages where houses are built around pedestrian connection, and we relegate cars to car parking precinct rather than building entire suburbs around the motor car. So there's some fundamental ideas, but I'm really, really excited about Grounded. And we're working with our managing director is actually Steve Hooker, who was the 2008 gold medalist in the pole vault. So this guy loves to aim high, if you don't mind the pun. And, and I think that because Steve's background is as an elite athlete, his ability to push through kind of big, hard things has been incredible. And he's got a background working with Stockland. So he's been incredible. So that's kind of what I've been working on for the last 18 months and probably the thing I'm most excited about.
Excellent. Well, look, thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for sharing the albums. It's not every day we get to see what's coming down the pipeline. To my final question for the day, you can probably expect what this is because the name of the podcast is Future Building Podcast. And it seems I can never really end an episode without asking our guest what they think is going to happen in the next little while. And just to give that some framing, I think I often think about the 5 to 10 year um, window. So what is it, Jeremy, that you think with your specific vision that you see happening in our industry in the next 5 to 10 years?
Matthew, I was dreading this question because I knew that it was coming. Um, and I was actually racking my brain last night and this morning, in the lead up to this interview, because I wanted to have something intelligent to tell you. And I think that if I'm absolutely honest, in this industry, like in architecture, design, construction, housing, I have no idea, Matthew. Like it seems like it's a runaway train. And it's unlike me not to have a vision or a clarity about how I think things are going to go. But it seems like there are so many strange political, jurisdictional, financial, market issues at play. I'm really sorry. I can't offer you uh, an answer with any clarity on that. To be totally honest, I don't know.
Hmm. Well, that's interesting, Jeremy, because if we were to look at another area of modern life, let's say the auto industry, right? Not the building industry, but the auto industry. And I would ask you what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. Do you think you'd be able to guess in that industry? An industry in which we have no real
100%.
expertise?
Yeah, so I have no expertise in the auto industry. In fact, I didn't own a car until 2 years ago. But what does it look like? It looks like, electrification by all the main brands by 2030. It looks
Yeah.
like all of those auto companies are moving to kind of mobility as a service. So, and that's probably happening in the next
Hmm.
years. So people won't own privately owned cars, but they'll be members of, the Volvo car share company or the Tesla car share company or the VW car share company or the Mercedes car share company. And then obviously with Tesla releasing, their autonomous vehicles, or rolling that out starting in September of this year in the States, it feels like, and when you and I were in San Francisco earlier this year, we saw Waymo running all of their trials in San Francisco with their robo taxis there. It feels like that is only probably, 2 years away in the States. So it's probably only, 3 to 4 years away in Australia. So I think that by 2030, we will have autonomous vehicles, you know, dropping people off and picking them up here.
I
Um,
agree with everything you just said, Jeremy, but don't you think this is rather strange that you as an expert, as a creator of the future, you were talking about influencing the future before, and I forget who made the quote, but somebody said the best way to influence the future is to create it.
yeah.
If anyone's done that in the shape of housing, it's been you, and so I'm perplexed that you you don't know it. Why do you, I mean, you spoke about the volatility of the moment. You spoke about the cross currents that are going through our market at the moment. Um, Maybe I'll ask the question another way. Are we destined to be in this, murky, uh, you know, future where no one sees what's coming down the pipeline until it arrives, and then of course it's always too late? Is that something we're destined to be part of, or do you see at some point that the crystal ball will clear up?
I think it's interesting, right, that housing um, and building generally and planning is linked to policy and politics, that we live in short political cycles. But if you think about the auto industry, it doesn't matter whether governments change hands. Generally, they don't mess with private industry too much. I mean, obviously, there might be some subsidies,
Mm,
onshore manufacturing or offshore manufacturing, but I think that the auto industry is able to invest significantly into R&D, into driving new markets, and they're not afraid to innovate because they have to survive. And so they kind of, build out their kind of 15-year plan, and they know what they're going to do, and they kind of step towards that and take the market with them. Um, I think that yeah, with housing, I think that, and the way that it's structured and that it's all generally speculative, that it always looks backward rather than looking forward. So I think that,
Mm.
ask me what does the future hold? Um, the thing is, it seems like that we've been going through rolling housing crises every 10 years for 100 years. And
Yes.
depending on what the political winds say, there are different kind of approaches to it. Um, but it does feel like it's getting, well, in fact, all the data says that it's getting significantly worse, not better. And the economist Alan Kohler, he basically says that if the government were to focus all of their attention on it now, that it would take 20 years of no kind of price growth in our housing market for it to return to a state of equity, rather than a state of inequity in this kind of class divide that we're seeing at the moment. So, and is there political courage to do that? And I would say no. So,
No, there doesn't appear to be. Yeah.
yeah, so I think that there's this emotive idea around, housing and buildings and then politics, that I think that in a democratic capitalist society, I don't think anyone's got the courage or the mandate to fix. So I'm sorry, that sounds grim, doesn't it?
Well, the good news is, Jeremy, you actually did have an answer. We just had to get under the hood a little further, I think. So
Yeah.
on that point, I'll remember next time to ask you what's going to happen 20 years from now. Uh, but at that point as well, I'll thank you for joining us today, Jeremy. I've had a ball, as I always do, talking to you, getting inside what Nightingale was all about, getting inside these new albums coming out of Breathe Architecture. We're all really excited. To our audience, I want to thank you for listening. As always, our notes and references will be added online to the show. Thanks for listening. And I also want to say a big thanks to our editor, Dr. Sarah Breen Lovett, who's been editing the podcast since the very beginning. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks to everyone. And thanks mostly again to you, Jeremy.
Thanks heaps, Matthew.